The truth in those words settled heavily on everyone present. Shadow wasn't just grieving, he was still on duty, still protecting his partner, still unwilling to leave his side, even now. Father Martinez, who had been waiting to continue the service, approached the casket with careful steps. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "we should give Shadow a moment with Officer Sullivan, as we would any family member." Elena nodded gratefully, her hand still resting on Shadow's back. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the slight tremor that ran through him with each breath. For 4 years, this dog had been part of their family, sleeping at the foot of their bed, joining them on camping trips, watching over their home when Mike worked late shifts. Now he was the last connection to the husband she had lost, the father her child would never know. "It's okay, Shadow," she whispered, leaning closer to the dog's ear. "I miss him too." As if her words had unlocked something within him, Shadow shifted slightly, making space for Elena's hand on Mike's uniform. They shared this moment of contact, human and canine united in loss, each understanding the other's pain in ways no one else in the church could comprehend. Across the aisle, Officer Ramirez exchanged glances with K9 Unit Commander Hargrove. Both were thinking the same thing. What would happen to Shadow now? Police dogs who lost their handlers sometimes recovered, sometimes didn't. The bond was too deep, too essential to their training and identity. And Shadow had been with Mike since he was a 12-week-old puppy, had never known another handler, another home. In the silence, Shadow suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricking forward, his gaze intensely focused on something no one else could see. The change was so abrupt that Elena stepped back slightly, startled by the transformation. The dog's posture shifted from grief to alert attention, his body becoming perfectly still except for his eyes, which tracked something invisible across the church. Several officers followed Shadow's gaze, looking for whatever had captured his attention. But there was nothing, just the empty space near the altar, the flickering candles, the solemn statues of saints watching over the proceedings. Officer Chen, who had been Mike's first partner when he joined the force, leaned forward in his seat. "What's he seeing?" he whispered to no one in particular. Shadow's breathing quickened, his focus unwavering as he continued to stare at the empty space. Then, almost imperceptibly, his tail moved. Not a full wag, but a slight shift, a recognition. Father Martinez crossed himself, murmuring something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Several other officers did the same, a ripple of motion through the otherwise still congregation. The atmosphere in the church changed, the heavy weight of sorrow remained, but something else entered with it. A prickling sense of uncertainty, of wonder. Shadow continued his vigil, his attention fixed on something only he could perceive. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she watched Shadow's behavior. The dog who had shared her life, who had known her husband's every mood and movement, was responding to something beyond her understanding. She wanted desperately to see what he saw, to know what he knew. Captain Morris finally broke the silence, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "I think," he said carefully, "that there are some things we aren't meant to explain." Church remained heavy with emotion. As Shadow finally settled again, his body relaxing slightly, his gaze still fixed on the empty space that apparently wasn't empty to him. What was happening in this solemn sanctuary had transcended a funeral service. It had become something else entirely, a glimpse into a connection that perhaps even death couldn't sever. The tension in St. Michael's hung suspended, like the dust motes dancing in the streams of colored light from the stained glass windows. Shadow remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the empty space near the altar, his body alert in a way that was achingly familiar to anyone who had ever worked with the K9 unit. It was his tracking posture, the stance he took when he had located something significant, Elena stood paralyzed beside the casket, her eyes darting between Shadow and the vacant space that had captured his complete attention. The child within her kicked suddenly, a sharp movement that made her press her hand more firmly against her belly. Even her unborn baby seemed to sense the strange energy that had filled the church. "He's tracking," Officer Ramirez whispered to Commander Hargrove, his voice barely audible. "That's his alert position." Hargrove nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. In 15 years with the K-9 division, he had witnessed countless incredible feats from their police dogs, finding suspects hidden in impossible locations, detecting microscopic traces of drugs or explosives, locating missing children through storms and wilderness. But this was different. There was nothing physically present for Shadow to detect. Shadow's ears twitched forward, rotating slightly as if he were listening to something beyond human hearing range. His muscles tensed beneath his shining coat, not with aggression, but with focused attention. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he let out a soft whine. Not of pain or distress, but the distinct sound he made when recognizing Mike after a separation. Father Martinez moved closer to the altar, his vestments rustling softly in the silence. "In times of great emotion," he said carefully, his voice gentle but carrying through the church, "we sometimes experience things that transcend ordinary understanding." He glanced at Shadow, then back at the congregation. "Perhaps we should be open to the possibility that Shadow perceives something we cannot." The suggestion rippled through the gathering. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their training and experience rooted firmly in evidence, in what could be proven and documented. Others leaned forward, their expressions softening as they watched Shadow's unwavering focus. Dr. Levine, the department psychologist who had helped many officers through trauma and loss, spoke up from her place in the fourth row. "Police dogs operate on a different sensory level than humans. Their perception isn't limited to what we can verify or understand." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "If Shadow senses Officer Sullivan's presence in some way, who are we to dismiss that possibility?" Elena moved slowly around the casket, approaching the space that had captured Shadow's attention. The dog's eyes tracked her movement, but his focus immediately returned to the empty air. She extended her hand tentatively, reaching into the vacant space, her fingers trembling visibly. "Mike," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The church fell completely silent, even the usual creaks and shifts of the old building seeming to pause in respect for this moment. Elena stood with her arm outstretched, tears streaming silently down her face, waiting for something, anything, that might confirm what Shadow appeared to be experiencing. Chief Donovan cleared his throat quietly, uncomfortable with the direction the service had taken. He was a practical man, respected for his no-nonsense approach to policing and leadership. "Perhaps we should continue with the service," he suggested, his voice carrying an authority that had ended countless debates in department meetings. But before anyone could respond, Shadow did something that silenced even the chief. The Belgian Malinois suddenly stood up on the casket, his posture changing from alert to what every K-9 officer present recognized immediately. It was his protective stance, the position he took when guarding Mike during dangerous operations. Shadow wasn't just sensing something, he was responding to it as if Mike were there, as if his partner needed protection even now. Officer Chen leaned toward his current partner, speaking, just above a whisper. "Remember that hostage situation at the bank last year, when Sullivan got pinned down by the shooter behind the counter?" His partner nodded. "Shadow stood exactly like that for 2 hours. Wouldn't leave his side even when they called in SWAT." The car. Memory circulated through the gathered officers, many of whom had witnessed that standoff. Shadow had remained positioned between Mike and the armed suspect until the situation was resolved, refusing recalls, ignoring commands from anyone but his handler. His loyalty had become department legend. Now that same unwavering dedication was on display again, but directed towards something or someone invisible to human eyes. Elena stepped back from the empty space, her hand dropping to her side. The brief contact with the nothingness had left her fingers unusually cold, as if she'd reached into a pocket of winter air in the otherwise warm church. She looked at her hand in confusion, then back at Shadow, whose attention remained fixed and vigilant. "He's not just grieving," she said, her voice steadier now. "He's still working, still on duty." The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes, but also a strange comfort. Shadow was continuing what he had always done, standing by Mike's side, protecting him even when it seemed impossible. Captain Morris descended from the pulpit, joining Elena beside the casket. He had been Mike's supervisor for 7 years, had approved the partnership with Shadow, had witnessed their evolution from a promising team to one of the department's most decorated duos. Now, he watched as the canine half of that partnership maintained his vigil with unwavering focus. "In the police department," Morris said, addressing the congregation but keeping his eyes on Shadow, "we talk about the thin blue line, the idea that we stand between order and chaos, between safety and danger." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "Maybe that line doesn't end where we think it does. Maybe Shadow is showing us that some bonds, some duties, continue beyond what we can see or understand." A murmur of agreement spread through the church. Even those who might have dismissed such sentiment under normal circumstances found themselves nodding, moved by the visible evidence of Shadow's conviction. Father Martinez placed a gentle hand on the edge of the casket. "There's a reason we call them faithful companions," he said softly. "Faith sees beyond the visible, beyond what can be proven or measured. It perceives truths that exist beyond our limited understanding." Shadow suddenly shifted his position, his ears pricking up even more alertly. His gaze tracked something moving across the space near the altar, following it with the precision that had made him one of the department's most valuable assets. Then, to everyone's astonishment, his tail began to wag, not the enthusiastic motion of playtime, but the controlled, dignified acknowledgement he reserved for working situations when Mike gave him approval. Elena gasped audibly, one hand flying, to cover her mouth. "He's responding to commands," she whispered, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Those are the same movements he makes when Mike signals him during an operation." Several K9 officers nodded in confirmation, their trained eyes catching the subtle shifts in Shadow's posture, the specific angle of his head, the set of his shoulders. These weren't random movements. They were the precise responses to handler signals that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. The air in the church seemed to thicken, charged with something beyond grief, beyond ceremony. Shadow continued his silent communication with the unseen, his body language clear to those who knew how to read it. Acknowledgement, attention, readiness. What followed would change how everyone in that church understood the boundaries between life and death, between what could be seen and what could only be felt. The bond between an officer and his K9 partner was revealing itself to be something far more profound than anyone had imagined, something that perhaps even death couldn't fully sever. If this glimpse into the mysterious connection between a K9 and his handler touches your heart, leave a comment sharing what you believe Shadow was experiencing. Don't forget to subscribe to see what happens next in this extraordinary story of loyalty beyond limits. The heavy silence in St. Michael's was broken by the soft sound of Shadow descending from the casket. The K9's movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he stepped down to the marble floor with surprising gentleness. His amber eyes remained locked on the empty space near the altar, his head tilted slightly in the characteristic angle that his handlers recognized as his listening posture. Officer Ramirez instinctively moved forward, ready to secure Shadow's leash once more, but Commander Hargrove placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," he murmured. "Let's see what he does." Shadow stood perfectly still for several heartbeats, his attention focused with laser precision on something invisible to everyone else. Then, with the same methodical pace he used during evidence searches, he began to walk slowly toward the altar. His path wasn't random or exploratory. He moved with purpose, following what appeared to be a specific trail that only he could detect. Elena took an involuntary step after him, but stopped herself, one hand pressed against her chest as if to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Captain Morris moved beside her, offering silent support as they watched Shadow's deliberate progress up the center aisle. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she felt the gentle pressure of Shadow's muzzle against her stomach. In the 4 years since Mike had brought home the then gangly puppy, she had witnessed countless demonstrations of the dog's remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. But this deliberate acknowledgement of her unborn child felt like something beyond training, beyond instinct. "He's never done that before," she said, her voice trembling with emotion as she looked to Commander Hargrove for explanation. The commander shook his head slightly. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, "not in 20 years with the K9 division." Shadow remained beside Elena, but turned his head back toward the altar area, his attention once more captured by something unseen. His ears pricked forward, rotating slightly as if tracking a sound moving through the church. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood and gave 2 short, sharp barks, the alert signal he used to indicate a positive identification during searches. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his police training overriding his uncertainty. "What's he alerting on?" he asked, scanning the empty space with professional suspicion. "Not what," said Sergeant Wilson, the retired K9 trainer. "Who?" The older man's weathered face had softened, his initial tears replaced by an expression of wondering acceptance. "He's identified his handler." A murmur ran through the church, a mixture of disbelief, hope, and unease. Modern police officers weren't trained to embrace supernatural explanations, yet the evidence of Shadow's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss through rational means. Father Martinez moved to stand beside Shadow, his clerical collar stark against his dark vestments. "Throughout history," he said, addressing the congregation, "animals have been recognized for their ability to perceive what humans cannot. In many traditions, they are seen as messengers between worlds, sensitive to presences that exist beyond a limited perception." Shadow turned at the priest's voice, looking up at him with an almost human expression of acknowledgement before returning his attention to the empty space that had so captured his focus. The dog's behavior had transformed the atmosphere in the church from one of unrelenting grief to something more complex, a strange mixture of sorrow and wonder, of loss and possibility. Elena knelt beside Shadow, her pregnancy making the movement. Awkward, but her need to connect with him overriding her discomfort. "What do you see, boy?" she whispered, running her fingers through the thick fur at his neck. "Is Mike here? Is he with us?" Shadow turned to her, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communication. Then with deliberate gentleness, he pressed his muzzle against her cheek, the same gesture of affection that Mike had taught him as a puppy, the touch that had become their family's ritual greeting at the end of each workday. The simple act broke something open in Elena. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her arms around Shadow's powerful neck, burying her face in his fur. "I know," she sobbed quietly. "I miss him too. We both do." Shadow remained steady under her embrace, his body providing the support she needed in that moment of overwhelming emotion. Around them, the congregation watched in respectful silence, witnesses to a grief that was both devastatingly personal and strangely universal. Dr. Levine shifted in her seat, her clinical perspective struggling to categorize what she was observing. "Grief manifests in remarkable ways," she said quietly to those nearby, "both in humans and animals. What we're seeing might be Shadow's unique processing of loss, filtered through his training and his bond with Officer Sullivan." Even as she offered this rational explanation, Shadow turned toward the sound of her voice, fixing her with a gaze so direct and seemingly knowing that the psychologist fell silent, her scientific certainties momentarily suspended. Captain Morris stepped forward, sensing that the ceremony needed to find its way back to more familiar ground. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "we should continue with the service. On a mic, as he would have wanted." He glanced at Shadow, still pressed against Elena's side. "All of us together." Father Martinez nodded in agreement, returning to his position to resume the funeral rites. Yet as he began to speak the ancient words of comfort and farewell, Shadow's attention remained divided. One part of him staying close to Elena, offering physical support as she returned to her seat. Another part, clearly attuned to something or someone else in the church, his ears continually tracking, his eyes occasionally darting to the empty space that only he seemed able to perceive. When the Belgian Malinois reached the spot that had held his attention, he stopped and sat down in the perfect form that had earned him top marks in every training evaluation. His posture was immaculate, back straight, head high, ears forward. The position he took when receiving commendation, or when Mike signaled that he had completed a task correctly. "That's his finish position," whispered Officer Chen to the rookie beside him. "It's what they do when they've successfully completed." "A track," the rookie nodded, unable to formulate a response as they watched Shadow maintain his perfect sit, his focus unwavering. The dog's behavior was so precise, so professional, that it almost seemed rehearsed, except no one had given him commands. No one had directed this unexpected performance that was now unfolding before their eyes. Father Martinez, who had been waiting near the altar to continue the service, found himself stepping aside as if making room for an unseen presence. The priest's expression reflected the same mixture of uncertainty and wonder that had spread throughout the congregation. Even in his decades of ministering to the faithful, of speaking about mysteries beyond human comprehension, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. Without warning, Shadow suddenly tilted his head back and released a sound that sent chills through everyone present. It wasn't a bark or a whine. It was the distinctive howl he reserved for successful missions, the sound that echoed through the K9 training facility whenever he and Mike completed a particularly challenging exercise. The howl started low, then rose in pitch, filling the church with its haunting resonance. The sound bounced off the vaulted ceiling, echoing back as if multiple dogs were responding to Shadow's call. Several officers shifted in their seats, disturbed by the eerie acoustics and the unnerving precision of Shadow's behaviors. This wasn't the chaotic expression of a grieving animal. It was the methodical performance of a highly trained officer, carrying out specific protocols. Elena took a shuddering breath, her hands now cradling her pregnant belly, as if to protect her unborn child from the overwhelming emotions sweeping through the church. "Those are their celebration rituals," she explained to Captain Morris, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sitting, the howl, it's what they do when they've completed a mission successfully. Mike always let him do it before they got back in the patrol car." As Shadow's howl faded, he remained sitting in his perfect position, but his attention had shifted. He was now looking back toward the congregation, scanning the faces as if seeking someone specific. His ears moved independently, rotating to track sounds that no one else could detect. Dr. Levine leaned forward in her seat, her professional detachment temporarily forgotten as she observed Shadow's behavior with undisguised fascination. "This goes beyond conditioned response," she murmured to Chief Donovan beside her. "There's an intention behind his actions. He's not just randomly displaying trained behaviors." The chief nodded slowly, his initial skepticism giving way to something less certain. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had learned to trust what he could verify, what could be documented and proven. But he had also learned to trust his officers. And Shadow, with his 47 successful tracking operations and 17 life-saving interventions, had earned that trust as thoroughly as any human on the force. Shadow's gaze finally settled on Elena, and with the same deliberate pace, he began walking toward her. His movements were measured, dignified, nothing like the frantic energy he had displayed earlier when rushing to Mike's casket. This was different, purposeful, almost solemn. When he reached Elena, Shadow gently pressed his muzzle against her hand, then looked up at her with an intelligence that seemed to transcend his canine nature. After a moment, he shifted slightly, to press his nose against her swollen belly, holding the position for several seconds before sitting back on his haunches. His posture, once again, perfect. The standard rituals of the police funeral proceeded, the readings, the prayers, the shared memories of Mike's service. But nothing about this service remained standard. Shadow's unexpected behaviors had transformed it into something else. Entirely, a glimpse into mysteries that extended beyond the visible world, beyond what could be explained or understood through ordinary means. And as the ceremony continued, no one could shake the feeling that perhaps they weren't just saying goodbye to Officer Michael Sullivan. Perhaps through Shadow's extraordinary perceptions, they were being shown that goodbye wasn't quite the right word at all. If Shadow's mysterious connection with the unseen touched your heart, please like this video. Could animals perceive what we cannot? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As Father Martinez continued with the funeral service, Shadow maintained his vigilant presence beside Elena, occasionally glancing toward the altar with that same focused attention. The traditional prayers and readings washed over the congregation, but few were fully engaged with the familiar liturgy. Their attention remained drawn to the Belgian Malinois, whose behavior had transformed an ordinary, if heartbreaking, ceremony into something transcendent. Officer Ramirez found himself watching Shadow more than listening to the priest's words. In his 8 years with the K9 unit, he had worked with dozens of police dogs, had witnessed their remarkable abilities and intelligence daily. Yet Shadow's actions today existed in a category beyond anything in his experience. The precision of the dog's behaviors, the deliberate nature of his movements. These weren't the random actions of a grieving animal, but something purposeful, something directed. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life, Father Martinez intoned, his voice carrying through the church as Shadow's ears twitched in response. Chief Donovan leaned slightly toward Captain Morris, keeping his voice low. "We need to think about Shadow's future placement," he murmured. "Sullivan was the only handler he ever had, retraining him to work with someone new." "With respect, sir," Morris interrupted quietly, "maybe this isn't the moment for that discussion." His eyes flickered toward Elena and Shadow, then back to his superior. "Let's get through today first." The chief nodded, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. But his concerns weren't merely administrative. Police K9s represented significant department investments, tens of thousands of dollars in training, years of specialized work, and Shadow was one of their most valuable assets. Yet beyond the practical considerations, Donovan had always prided himself on ensuring that the department's K9 officers were treated with the respect their service merited. Shadow's future placement needed to be handled with sensitivity, especially given the extraordinary bond he had shared with Mike. The service progressed to the time for eulogies. Captain Morris took the pulpit first, sharing memories of Mike's courage under pressure, his commitment to community policing, his mentorship of younger officers. As Morris spoke, Shadow's behavior shifted slightly. The dog's attention, which had been divided between Elena and the mysterious empty space, now focused entirely on the captain's words. Mike Sullivan embodied what it means to be a police officer, Morris continued, his voice growing thicker with emotion. He never sought recognition or advancement. He simply showed up day after day to serve and protect with uncommon dedication. Shadow's ears moved forward at the mention of his partner's name, a small whine escaping his throat. Elena stroked, his fur gently drawing comfort from the warm solidity of his presence beside her. When Morris finished, Elena rose slowly to her feet. She had initially declined to speak, overwhelmed by grief and her advanced pregnancy, but Shadow's unexpected actions had changed something within her. She moved deliberately to the pulpit, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other reaching back briefly to touch Shadow's head as she passed him. "I had planned to just listen today," she began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. "To let others share their memories of Mike, but something happened in this church that I can't ignore." She glanced down at Shadow, who had risen to follow her and now sat at perfect attention beside the pulpit. "Most of you knew Mike as Officer Sullivan. You worked with him, trained with him, trusted him with your lives." She paused, gathering herself. "I knew a different Mike, the one who sang off-key in the shower, who spent 3 weeks building a treehouse for his niece, who cried when the doctor confirmed I was pregnant, then immediately started planning college funds and baseball leagues." A sad smile crossed her face at the memory, but she continued, stronger now. But Shadow knew both versions of Mike. He moved between our worlds effortlessly, professional in the field and playful at home. Mike always said that Shadow understood him better than any human possibly could. Shadow looked up at Elena as she spoke, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that many in the congregation found unsettling. It was almost as if he understood every word she was saying. "What we've witnessed today," Elena continued, "is something I don't fully understand. But I know this. The connection between Mike and Shadow wasn't just training. It wasn't just partnership. It was something deeper, something that apparently doesn't simply end when a heart stops beating." She glanced toward the space near the altar that had so captured Shadow's attention. "I can't see what Shadow sees. I can't hear what he hears, but I'm choosing to believe that somehow, in some way, Mike is still here, still watching over us, still connected to the partner who never left his side." Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their professional skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of Shadow's behavior and the emotional power of Elena's words. Others nodded slightly, their expressions softening as they watched Shadow's continued alertness. "I don't have answers," Elena concluded, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "But I have Shadow. And today, he's shown me that maybe goodbye isn't quite what we thought it was." As she stepped away from the pulpit, Shadow moved immediately to her side, pressing against her leg in a supportive gesture that hadn't been part of his official training but had developed naturally over their years together. The remainder of the service continued with police tradition. The final radio call, the folding of the flag, the formal presentation to Elena as Mike's next of kin. Throughout it all, Shadow maintained his place beside her, occasionally glancing toward the altar. Space, but remaining steadfastly at her side as each ritual unfolded. When the formal service concluded, the congregation rose for the recession. The honor guard moved into position to escort Mike's casket from the church to the waiting hearse that would carry him to his final resting place at the cemetery across town. As the pallbearers lifted the casket, Shadow watched with alert attention, his body tensing slightly as his partner's remains were moved. Elena, holding the folded flag against her chest, looked down at Shadow with concern. Would he try to follow the casket again? Would he refuse to be separated from Mike? Her worries were justified. Canine handlers had documented numerous cases of police dogs refusing to leave their deceased partners, sometimes requiring sedation, to be removed from the scene. But Shadow surprised everyone again. As the casket was carried down the aisle, he stood at perfect attention beside Elena, watching the procession with dignity. His eyes followed the movement, but his body remained disciplined, controlled. When the last of the honor guard passed their pew, Shadow looked up at Elena, as if seeking direction. Officer Ramirez approached cautiously, Shadow's leash in hand. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "would you like me to take him for the cemetery portion? It might be easier for you." Elena looked down at Shadow, then back at Ramirez. "No," she replied firmly. "He stays with me. Mike would want that." Ramirez nodded, handing her the leash instead. "Of course, ma'am." As they moved to follow the procession, Dr. Levine approached Elena, her professional demeanor softened by what she had witnessed. "Mrs. Sullivan, what we saw today was extraordinary," she said. "If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to document Shadow's behaviors. There's very little research on grief responses in working dogs, and his experience might help others understand." "He's not a research subject," Elena interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "He's family." She placed a protective hand on Shadow's head. "Whatever he experienced today belongs to him, to Mike, and to us. I'm sorry." Dr. Levine nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "Of course. I apologize for intruding." The congregation moved slowly out of the church into the bright afternoon sunlight, a stark contrast to the solemn dimness of the sanctuary. Shadow blinked against the sudden brightness, but remained steadfastly beside Elena, his training allowing him to navigate the crowd with perfect awareness of her needs, adjusting his pace to her pregnant waddle. As they approached the hearse, Shadow's attention suddenly shifted. His head turned sharply toward a patch of empty air near the church steps, his ears pricking forward in that now familiar gesture of recognition. Several nearby officers noticed immediately, their own attention, drawn to whatever had captured Shadow's focus. "There he goes again," murmured Officer Chen to his partner. "Same behavior as inside." Shadow's nose twitched as if catching a scent, and then he did something that sent a collective shiver through those watching. He wagged his tail, not the full-body wag of excited play, but the controlled, dignified acknowledgement he gave when Mike presented him to superior officers or distinguished visitors. Elena froze, watching Shadow's focused attention on the empty space. "Mike," she whispered, so quietly that only those closest to her could hear. Shadow's tail wagged once more, his posture remaining formal but his recognition unmistakable. Then, as naturally as if responding to a familiar command, he turned back to Elena and returned his attention to their path toward the waiting cars. Captain Morris, who had observed the entire interaction, felt a cold sensation travel down his spine despite the warm sunshine. He had seen Shadow perform countless times in training exercises and field operations. He knew the precise nature of the dog's trained responses, the specific meanings of each tail position, ear movement, and vocal signal. What he had just witnessed was Shadow's formal acknowledgement of a superior officer, the exact posture and movement the dog had always shown when Mike introduced him to Brass from downtown. Morris caught Chief Donovan's eye, knowing the older man had seen it too. The chief's expression remained neutral, professional, but the slight pallor beneath his tan suggested he was equally affected by what they had observed. "We've got the procession route secured," the chief said, changing the subject with deliberate pragmatism. "Motorcycle escort all the way to Oak Hill. The roads will be clear." Morris nodded, grateful for the return to operational details, to the concrete world of police procedure where everything made sense. Yet as they moved toward their vehicles, he found himself glancing back at Shadow, now being helped into the passenger seat of the family car beside Elena. The Belgian Malinois settled into the seat with unusual stillness, his attention focused out the windshield as if he could see something or someone that remained invisible to human eyes. The funeral procession formed with traditional precision, police motorcycles at the front and rear, the hearse carrying Mike's remains, the family car with Elena and Shadow, followed by dozens of patrol cars with lights activated but sirens respectfully silent. As they pulled away from St. Michael's, Morris couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't leaving something behind, but rather taking it with them, an unseen presence that Shadow alone seemed able to perceive. The procession wound through the city streets toward Oak Hill Cemetery, passing beneath overpasses where other officers stood at attention, saluting as Mike's hearse passed below. Citizens stopped on sidewalks, many placing hands over hearts in spontaneous gestures of respect. Through it all, Shadow remained unusually still beside Elena, his attention occasionally shifting to that same unseen presence, his behavior continuing to be both a comfort and a mystery to those watching. What awaited them at the cemetery would further challenge the boundaries between the seen and unseen, between loss and connection, between what was possible and what was real. Shadow's extraordinary behavior had only just begun to reveal itself. The procession arrived at Oak Hill Cemetery under a sky that had cleared to a pristine blue, the earlier rain leaving behind a glistening sheen on the grass and headstones. Police vehicles lined the narrow cemetery road, their lights flashing in silent tribute as the hearse carrying Officer Sullivan came to a stop beside the prepared gravesite. The cemetery grounds crew had worked since dawn to prepare the officer's final resting place in the section reserved for fallen public servants. An artificial turf covered the excavated soil, and arrangements of white and blue flowers, the colors of the Chicago Police Department, surrounded the open grave. The precision and care evident in these preparations reflected the department's commitment to honoring one of their own. Shadow's demeanor changed as Elena helped him out of the car. The Belgian Malinois scanned the cemetery grounds with professional attention, his training activating as he assessed the new environment. His ears rotated independently, tracking multiple sounds: the rustle of the honor guard assembling, the quiet conversations of arriving mourners, the distant sound of traffic beyond the cemetery walls. Yet through this standard security sweep, his attention repeatedly returned to a specific spot near Mike's gravesite, his focus sharpening each time. Elena noticed immediately, tightening her grip slightly on Shadow's leash as they approached the grave. The folded flag she had received at the church was now carried by Captain Morris, who walked beside her in silent support. Behind them, officers from across the city formed orderly rows, their dress uniforms creating a sea of dark blue against the cemetery's green landscape. Father Martinez took his position at the head of the grave, his prayer book open as he prepared for the final committal service. The pallbearers moved with solemn coordination to position Mike's casket on the mechanical lowering device that would ease him into the earth when the time came. Throughout these preparations, Shadow remained unusually calm beside Elena, showing none of the distress or confusion that had marked his earlier behavior at the church. "He seems different here," Officer Ramirez observed quietly to Commander Hargrove as they took their places in the formation. "More settled." Hargrove nodded slightly. "He knows what this is," he replied, his voice equally low. "They understand more than we give them credit for." The graveside service began with the traditional honors for a fallen officer. The honor guard presented arms, their movements executed with flawless precision. The department chaplain offered a brief prayer, his words barely audible over the gentle breeze that had begun to stir the cemetery trees. Father Martinez then began the ancient words of committal, speaking of dust returning to dust, of souls returning to God who gave them. Throughout these rituals, Shadow maintained perfect positioning beside Elena, his body relaxed yet alert, occasionally glancing at that same empty space that had captured his attention earlier. There was something different about his behavior now, less frantic, less searching. If anything, he appeared almost content, as if something that had been unsettled had finally found resolution. When the time came for the final radio call, the cemetery fell into complete silence. A dispatcher's voice crackled over the portable speaker system that had been set up beside the grave. Dispatch to Unit K42. Dispatch to Officer Michael Sullivan. The pause that followed was heavy with, meaning the absence of response, underscoring the permanence of what they had gathered to acknowledge. Dispatch to Unit K42. Officer Michael Sullivan is 10-7. End of watch February 15th, 2025. Officer Sullivan, we thank you for your service. You will not be forgotten. As the final notes of the radio call faded, Shadow's posture shifted subtly. His ears pricked forward, his head tilting in the characteristic angle of intense listening. Several officers exchanged glances, recognizing that the dog was once again tracking something unseen, his attention completely focused despite the emotional weight of the moment surrounding him. Elena noticed immediately, her hand tightening on the leash as she watched Shadow's behavior. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, following his gaze to the empty space beside her. Commander Hargrove moved closer, his decades of experience with K9 officers giving him unique insight into what they were witnessing. "He's listening," he explained quietly. "That's his command posture. It's how he looks when receiving specific instructions." As if confirming the commander's assessment, Shadow suddenly stood straighter, his ears fully forward, his body tensing, in preparation for action. Then, without warning but with deliberate control, he tugged gently against Elena's grip, not in an attempt to break free, but clearly communicating his need to move. Elena looked to Hargrove, uncertainty clear in her eyes. "I think," the commander said carefully, "you should let him go. He won't leave the area. He's trying to complete something." After a moment's hesitation, Elena loosened her hold on the leash, allowing Shadow the freedom to move. The Belgian Malinois immediately stepped forward, approaching Mike's casket with dignified purpose. The officers nearest the grave parted silently, creating a path for him. When Shadow reached the casket, he didn't leap up as he had in the church. Instead, he circled it once, his nose nearly touching the polished wood, before sitting at precise attention at the head of the casket, facing the assembled officers as if taking up guard duty. Captain Morris felt his throat tighten at the sight. It was exactly how Shadow positioned himself during protection details, the precise form and posture he maintained when guarding a location or person of importance. The dog wasn't acting out of grief or confusion now. He was performing a specific duty, one he had been trained for and had executed countless times. "Last watch," Sergeant Wilson murmured, the retired K9 trainer's eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's standing his final post." The observation rippled through the assembled officers, many of whom nodded in solemn understanding. It was a tradition as old as policing itself, the partner's final watch, the last act of protection and respect. Father Martinez, recognizing the significance of the moment, paused the formal service, allowing space for this unexpected ceremony within a ceremony. Even Chief Donovan, despite his earlier pragmatism, stood in respectful silence, his hand moving to touch the badge on his chest in an unconscious gesture of solidarity. Shadow maintained his position as the honor guard began the ritual of folding the American flag that had been draped over the casket. The sharp creases and precise movements created a triangle of stars and stripes, a symbol of sacrifice that would be presented to Elena. Throughout this solemn procedure, Shadow remained motionless, his attention divided between his guard duty and that same unseen presence that had so captured his focus throughout the day. When the flag was fully folded, Chief Donovan stepped forward to present it to Elena. As he approached, Shadow's ears tracked his movement, but the dog remained at his post, allowing the chief to pass. The moment carried both official formality and devastating intimacy, the symbols of the state acknowledging the personal sacrifice of a family. On behalf of the President of the United States, the city of Chicago, and a grateful police department, Donovan said, his official voice softened by genuine emotion. Please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for Mike's service and sacrifice. Elena received the flag with trembling hands, her composure finally breaking as she clutched the folded fabric to her chest. Beside her, Officer Ramirez stepped closer, offering silent support as her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. It was at this moment that Shadow finally moved from his position. With the flag presented, with that formal duty completed, he rose and walked deliberately to Elena's side, pressing his body against her legs in a gesture of support that went beyond training into something instinctual and profound. As the casket began its mechanical descent into the earth, Shadow watched with focused attention, his body tensing slightly at the movement. Several officers braced themselves, half expecting him to lunge forward to try to prevent this final separation. But Shadow remained beside Elena, his posture alert, but his behavior controlled, as if he understood that this too was part of the ceremony, part of the duty. When the casket reached the bottom of the grave, Father Martinez stepped forward to offer the final blessing. As he spoke the ancient words of comfort and release, Shadow's attention shifted once more to that empty space beside the grave, his ears rotating forward, his body stilling in that now familiar posture of recognition. Officer Chen, standing at the edge of the gathering, found himself involuntarily following Shadow's gaze, searching for whatever had captured the dog's attention. There was nothing visible, just air, just the space above the freshly dug grave. Yet Shadow's focus was so absolute, so certain, that Chen found himself wondering. In his 12 years on the force, he had seen things he couldn't explain, had experienced moments that defied rational understanding. This didn't feel so different. As the service concluded, officers began the ritual of placing white carnations on the casket, filing past one by one to pay their final respects. When Elena's turn came, Shadow moved with her, staying close as she placed her flower and whispered a private goodbye. But as they turned to leave, Shadow did something unexpected once more. He stopped, turning back toward the grave with deliberate purpose. Then, with precise movements that seemed almost choreographed, he raised his right paw and held it in a perfect salute position, the specialized gesture Mike had trained him to perform for formal police ceremonies. The salute lasted 3 seconds, exactly the protocol duration, before Shadow lowered his paw and returned to Elena's side. The gathered officers, many of whom had witnessed this trained behavior at department ceremonies, stood in stunned silence. It wasn't just the salute itself that affected them so deeply. It was the perfect timing, the flawless execution, as if Shadow had received a specific command to perform it at exactly that moment. Dr. Levine, observing from a respectful distance, found her scientific certainties increasingly challenged. "That's a directed behavior," she whispered to no one in particular. "That's not spontaneous. That's a response to a specific signal." Chief Donovan overheard her comment, his expression unreadable, as he watched Shadow and Elena begin the walk back toward the waiting cars. "I'm not sure I want to think too hard about what that means, Doctor," he said quietly. Some things are better left unanalyzed. As the cemetery gathering began to disperse, officers moving toward their vehicles for the traditional reception at the department headquarters, Shadow walked beside Elena with renewed purpose. His earlier distress had transformed into something else entirely, a dignified awareness, an almost protective presence as he matched his pace to her slower, pregnant gait. Captain Morris found himself watching them, struck by the transformation in Shadow's demeanor since the morning. The frantic energy, the desperate searching had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like acceptance, like understanding. Whatever Shadow had experienced today, whatever connection he had made or maintained with his handler, seemed to have brought him a kind of peace that Morris wouldn't have thought possible. As they reached the cemetery gates, Shadow suddenly paused, looking back toward Mike's grave one final time. His posture remained alert, attentive, but there was something different now. A readiness, a forward focus that hadn't been there before. Then with a soft exhale that was almost a sigh, he turned back to Elena and continued walking, moving not away from something left behind, but toward whatever lay ahead. The mystery of what Shadow had perceived throughout this day, what he had seen or heard or sensed that remained inaccessible to human awareness, would continue to resonate with everyone who had witnessed it. But as the cemetery fell quiet once more, as the last police vehicles departed with lights flashing in final tribute, one thing remained certain. The bond between an officer and his canine partner had revealed itself to be something far more profound than training, far more enduring than anyone could have imagined. Do you believe animals can sense what we cannot? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to see how Shadow's story continues. The reception following Officer Sullivan's funeral was held in the large community room at the 6th Precinct headquarters, the station Mike had called home for his entire 15-year career. The space had been transformed from its usual utilitarian function into something more solemn. Tables covered with blue cloths, arrangements of white flowers, and a memorial display of Mike's awards, commendations and photographs from his years of service. Officers mingled in subdued conversation, sharing memories and offering support to one another in the way that only those who face danger together truly understand. The thin blue line wasn't just a symbol here, it was a tangible presence, a connection forged through shared risk and purpose. Elena sat in a chair near the memorial display, the folded flag resting on a small table beside her. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of officers, city officials, and community members had approached to offer condolences, share stories, or simply sit with her in companionable silence. Through it all, Shadow remained at her side, his behavior having settled into a calm watchfulness that was both professional and comforting. Chief Donovan approached, carrying a small plate of food. "You should eat something, Elena," he said, his gruff voice softened by genuine concern. Mike would insist on it. She smiled faintly, accepting the plate more out of politeness than hunger. "Thank you, Chief." Donovan glanced down at Shadow, who acknowledged him with a brief eye contact before returning to his vigilant survey of the room. "He's doing remarkably well," the chief observed. "After what happened earlier, I wasn't sure." "He's always been intuitive," Elena replied, running her free hand along Shadow's back. "Even as a puppy, Mike used to say he was born old, like he already understood things most dogs take years to learn." The chief nodded, his eyes moving to the memorial display, lingering on a photograph of Mike and Shadow at their academy graduation. "I've been meaning to discuss his future with you," he said carefully. "Not today, of course, but soon. He's still young, still has years of service potential. The department would like to—" "He's staying with me," Elena interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "Mike's life insurance is more than adequate. I don't need the department's compensation for—" Him? Donovan looked surprised. I wasn't going to suggest separation, Elena. The bond between a canine and his handler's family is something we respect. I was going to propose that Officer Ramirez continue Shadow's field training. He could remain living with you, but still do what he was trained for. Elena's hand stilled on Shadow's back. She hadn't considered this possibility, that Shadow could continue his police work while remaining part of her household. She glanced down at the Belgian Malinois, wondering what he would want. Would retirement at his age be a kindness or a frustration for a dog bred and trained for active service? Before she could respond, Shadow suddenly tensed beside her, his attention snapping to the entrance of the community room. His ears pricked forward, his posture becoming alert without being aggressive. Both Elena and the chief followed his gaze, to see Officer Chen entering, accompanied by an elderly woman Elena didn't recognize. The woman moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, her white hair arranged neatly beneath a simple black hat. Chen guided her carefully through the crowd, his usual confident stride modified to match her fragile pace. As they approached, Elena could see that the woman's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her lined face bearing the dignified sorrow of someone well acquainted with loss. "Mrs. Sullivan," Chen said formally, "this is Mrs. Abigail Winters. She asked specifically to speak with you." Elena nodded politely, curious about this stranger who had come to Mike's memorial. "Of course, please sit down." As Mrs. Winters lowered herself carefully into the chair beside Elena, Shadow's behavior underwent a subtle but significant change. The tension in his body eased, and he moved slightly closer to the elderly woman, his nose twitching as he caught her scent. After a moment's assessment, he did something unexpected. He placed his head gently on her knee, looking up at her with an uncharacteristic familiarity. Mrs. Winters gasped softly, her wrinkled hand moving automatically to stroke Shadow's head. "Oh," she whispered, "he remembers." Elena exchanged confused glances with Chief Donovan. "I'm sorry, do you know Shadow?" The elderly woman nodded, tears welling in her faded blue eyes. "Your husband and this beautiful dog saved my life last winter," she explained, her voice wavering with emotion. "I was trapped in my apartment when the building caught fire. The smoke was so thick, I couldn't find my way out." Understanding dawned on Elena's face. "The West Side apartment fire. Mike mentioned it. You were on the 3rd floor." "Yes," Mrs. Winters confirmed. "The firefighters couldn't get to me because the stairwell had collapsed. But your husband," her voice broke slightly, "he and Shadow found another way. They came through from this adjacent building, across a maintenance walkway that wasn't even on the building plans." Chief Donovan nodded, remembering the incident report. Sullivan discovered it during a routine patrol the month before. He'd made a mental note of it. Mrs. Winters continued stroking Shadow's head, her gnarled fingers moving with gentle appreciation through his fur. "I was unconscious when they found me. The smoke. I shouldn't have survived. The doctors said so." She looked directly at Elena, her eyes suddenly intense despite their age. "But your husband refused to leave me. He carried me across that walkway, with this brave dog leading the way through smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face." Shadow remained with his head on the woman's knee, his usual alertness softened into something more contemplative. Elena watched him, struck by his evident recognition of Mrs. Winters, despite having encountered her only once, under extreme conditions. "I had to come today," Mrs. Winters continued, "to thank you, to tell you what kind of man your husband was. He risked everything for a stranger." She glanced down at Elena's pregnant belly. "When I read about the accident in the paper, when I saw he had a child on the way, it broke my heart." Elena placed her hand over Mrs. Winters, the two women, connected by Mike's final act of service. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to hear this." As they spoke, Shadow suddenly lifted his head from Mrs. Winters' knee, his attention shifting to the empty space beside her chair. His ears rotated forward, his head tilting in that now familiar posture of recognition. Both women fell silent, watching as Shadow's focus intensified on the vacant air. Officer Chen, who had remained standing nearby, stepped closer. "He's doing it again," he said quietly to the chief. "Same as at the church and cemetery." Mrs. Winters looked confused. "Doing what?" Elena hesitated, uncertain how to explain what had been happening throughout the day without sounding irrational. Shadow has been sensing something, or someone, since this morning at the funeral. The elderly woman's expression changed, her confusion giving way to a strange understanding. "Oh," she breathed, looking at the empty space beside her with new awareness. "Oh, I see." Something in her tone made Elena lean forward. What do you see?" Mrs. Winters turned back to Elena, her eyes now filled with a calm certainty. "When I was unconscious in that fire before your husband found me, I had what the doctors later called a near-death experience." Her voice lowered, becoming almost confidential. "I saw my late husband as clearly as I see you now. He told me it wasn't my time yet, that someone was coming to help me." Chief Donovan shifted uncomfortably, his pragmatic nature struggling with the direction of the conversation. But Elena nodded encouragingly, her attention fully focused on Mrs. Winters' words. "Since then," the elderly woman continued, "I've noticed things, small things at first. The scent of my husband's cologne when no one was there, the sound of his favorite song playing on a radio that wasn't turned on." She glanced at Shadow, who remained focused on the empty space. "And animals react to me differently now. My daughter's cat follows me around the house, staring at spaces beside me. My neighbor's dog barks in greeting at empty air when I walk past." Elena felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the crowded room. "You think Shadow is seeing—" I think," Mrs. Winters interrupted gently, "that your husband saved more than just my physical life that day. I think something happened in that burning building, something that connected us in ways we don't fully understand." She reached out, placing her hand on Elena's. "And I think Shadow recognizes that connection." Shadow's attention suddenly shifted, his head turning sharply toward the main doors of the community room. His body tensed again, but not with alarm, with anticipation. Across the room, several other officers' K9 partners, who had been resting quietly under tables or beside their handlers, simultaneously raised their heads, their attention focusing in the same direction. Officer Ramirez, who had been chatting with colleagues near the refreshment table, noticed immediately. "Chief," he called softly, gesturing toward the unusual synchronized behavior of the dogs. Before anyone could respond, Shadow stood and moved deliberately toward the doors, his movement purposeful but unhurried. The other canines watched but remained in place, creating an eerie tableau of canine attention, all focused on Shadow and whatever he was approaching. Elena started to rise, concerned about Shadow leaving her side, but Mrs. Winters placed a gentle, restraining hand on her arm. "Let him go," she advised quietly. "He knows what he's doing." The room had fallen into curious silence, conversations tapering off as officers noticed the strange behavior of the dogs and Shadow's deliberate progress. Toward the exit, even Chief Donovan, for all his practical skepticism, found himself holding his breath as Shadow reached the doors and stopped, sitting at perfect attention as if waiting for someone to enter. For several long moments, nothing happened. Shadow remained in his position, utterly still except for the slight movement of his ears. Then, with no visible trigger, he stood again and walked back toward Elena and Mrs. Winters, his mission apparently completed. As Shadow returned to Elena's side, the atmosphere in the room gradually returned to normal. Conversations resumed. The other canines settled back into their resting positions, and the moment of inexplicable tension dissipated. But for those who had been watching closely, something significant had occurred. Something that defied easy explanation. Mrs. Winters patted Shadow's head as he settled once more at Elena's feet. "Your husband was a remarkable man," she said simply, "and he had a remarkable partner." Captain Morris, who had observed the entire interaction from across the room, approached with careful steps. "Elena," he said gently, "I've been speaking with the K9 division. We've decided that Shadow's future should be entirely your decision. If you want him to retire, to simply be your family dog, the department will process all the necessary paperwork. If you'd prefer him to continue serving, we'll work out an arrangement with Officer Ramirez for part-time deployments." Elena looked down at Shadow, who had shifted to press his body protectively against her legs, his attention now calmly divided between his surroundings and her. The decision seemed both monumental and obvious. "He needs purpose," she said finally. "Mike always said working dogs aren't happy without a job to do." She stroked Shadow's head, feeling the strong muscle and bone beneath his fur. "But I need him too. He's my last connection to Mike." Morris nodded in understanding. "We'll work something out. Part-time deployment, special assignments only. He can stay with you, be there when the baby comes, but still serve when it makes sense." "Thank you," Elena said, genuine gratitude in her voice. Mike would want that. As the afternoon progressed, Elena found herself watching Shadow with new awareness. His behavior had stabilized, the frantic energy of the morning replaced by a calm vigilance that seemed to encompass both his police training and something more personal, more connected to her. Occasionally, his attention would still shift to empty spaces, his head tilting in that listening posture. But these moments no longer seemed desperate or confused, merely attentive, acknowledging. Mrs. Winters remained beside Elena for nearly an hour, the two women sharing stories and finding unexpected comfort in each other's company. When it was finally time for the elderly woman to leave, she leaned heavily on her cane as she rose from her chair. "I'll visit, if that's all right with you," she said, her free hand resting briefly on Elena's shoulder. "Perhaps when the baby comes. Every child needs grandmothers, even borrowed ones." Elena smiled, genuinely moved by the offer. "I'd like that very much." As Officer Chen prepared to escort Mrs. Winters to her waiting taxi, Shadow rose and moved to her side, walking beside her with careful attention to her slow pace. The gesture wasn't part of his training, but seemed to emerge from some deeper understanding, a recognition of vulnerability, of the need for protection that transcended official duty. At the door, Mrs. Winters paused and looked down at Shadow. "One last time. Take care of them," she said softly, words meant only for canine ears. "Both of them." Shadow's ears twitched forward at her words, his amber eyes meeting hers in a moment of communication that needed no human interpretation. Then, with a last gentle pat on his head, Mrs. Winters continued her slow progress out of the building, leaving behind a connection that had been forged through tragedy but transformed into something healing. Elena watched them go, her hand resting on her belly where Mike's child grew, protected and unknowing. The day had been filled with grief, with unexpected mysteries, with moments that defied rational explanation. Yet as she felt Shadow return to her side, his warm presence solid and real against her leg, she found herself facing the future with something that felt surprisingly like hope. Whatever Shadow had experienced today, whatever he had seen or sensed that remained invisible to human perception, had changed him. The desperate dog who had leaped into Mike's casket, searching frantically for his partner, had transformed into something else. A guardian with a new purpose, a connection between what had been lost and what remained. as the reception began to wind down, officers departing with final handshakes and embraces, Elena found a moment of unexpected peace amid the sorrow. Shadow's extraordinary behavior throughout this painful day had given her something precious. Not answers, perhaps, but possibilities. The possibility that connections weren't severed as absolutely as they appeared. The possibility that love and loyalty created bonds that transcended ordinary understanding. The possibility that goodbye wasn't quite what she had thought it was. Do bonds of love and loyalty transcend death? Has your pet ever sensed things you couldn't see? Share your experiences in the comments below and subscribe to witness more remarkable stories of connection beyond understanding. 3 weeks after Officer Michael Sullivan's funeral, Elena struggled to find a comfortable position on her couch. Her advanced pregnancy making even the simplest movements challenging. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier, despite Shadow's constant presence. The Belgian Malinois had hardly left her side since the funeral, as if he had transferred his protective instincts entirely to her and the child she carried. Early morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting warm patterns across the living room floor where Shadow lay, his eyes tracking Elena's every movement with calm attentiveness. His behavior had stabilized in the weeks following Mike's death, settling into a new rhythm that balanced vigilance with a gentler, more domestic kind of care. Elena sipped her herbal tea, watching Shadow over the rim of her mug. "What goes on in that head of yours, boy?" she murmured. "What do you understand that I don't?" Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, his amber eyes meeting hers with that uncanny intelligence that had always set him apart, even among the department's elite canine officers. In the 3 years since Mike had brought him home as a fully trained police dog, Elena had come to recognize the subtle communications in his posture, his expressions, the tilt of his head. But since the funeral, she'd found herself studying him with new attention, looking for clues to what he might be perceiving beyond ordinary reality. The doorbell rang, breaking the morning stillness. Shadow was on his feet immediately, alert, but not alarmed, his posture indicating recognition rather than concern. Elena smiled slightly, knowing who it must be. Shadow's threat assessment was more reliable than any security system. "Coming!" she called, leveraging herself off the couch. With effort, Shadow paced beside her as she waddled to the door, his body positioned slightly ahead of hers, a protective habit that had become more pronounced since Mike's death. Officer Ramirez stood on the porch, dressed in casual clothes rather than his uniform, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Elena," he greeted her with a warm smile before looking down at Shadow. "Hey, partner, ready for some exercise?" The arrangement they had worked out with the department had proved beneficial for everyone involved. 3 mornings a week, Ramirez would take Shadow for training exercises and occasionally for special canine deployments. The rest of the time, Shadow remained with Elena, fulfilling his new role as her guardian and companion. Shadow's tail wagged slightly at the sight of Ramirez, not the exuberant greeting he might once have given Mike, but a dignified acknowledgement of a respected colleague. The transition hadn't been seamless. The first training session had been challenging, with Shadow clearly disoriented by taking commands from someone other than Mike. But his professionalism had ultimately prevailed, his years of discipline allowing him to adapt to the new arrangement. "He's been restless this morning," Elena told Ramirez, handing over Shadow's leash. "I think he needs the workout." Ramirez nodded, clipping the leash to Shadow's collar. "We've got some tracking exercises planned with the cadets. Nothing too strenuous, but it'll keep his skills sharp." He hesitated, then added more gently, "How are you feeling? Getting close now, right?" Elena rested both hands on her swollen belly. 3 weeks, give or take. Dr. Martinez says everything looks good. She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just wish Mike was here to see it. Ramirez's expression softened with understanding. He'd be proud, Elena, of both of you. He glanced down at Shadow, who had positioned himself between them, his attention divided between the familiar humans. This guy's going to be the most protective big brother any kid could ask for. The observation brought a genuine smile to Elena's face. I know. He's already guarding. Follows me everywhere, even sleeps right outside the nursery door. She reached down to stroke Shadow's head. Be good today, okay? Listen to Officer Ramirez. Shadow looked up at her, then at Ramirez, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the exchange. With a last gentle nudge against Elena's hand, he turned and followed Ramirez toward the waiting police SUV, his movement smooth and purposeful. Every inch, the professional K-9 officer, despite the unusual circumstances of his deployment. Elena watched them drive away, feeling the momentary pang she always experienced when Shadow left her side. His presence had become a comfort in ways she hadn't anticipated, a living connection to Mike that went beyond memories or photographs. There was something in Shadow's unwavering loyalty, his quiet understanding, that made the overwhelming grief a little more bearable. Closing the door, she made her way back to the living room, pausing to look at the collection of photographs arranged on the mantel. Mike in his dress uniform at his promotion ceremony, Mike and Shadow at their K-9 unit graduation. Their wedding day, Mike's smile so bright it seemed to leap from the frame. And the most recent addition, the ultrasound image of their child, positioned beside Mike's official police portrait, as if in conversation across the divide of life and death. The house phone rang, startling her from her reverie. Elena checked the caller ID before answering. "Hello, Mrs. Winters." "Good morning, dear," came the elderly woman's warm voice. "I was wondering if you might like some company today. I've made far too much chicken soup for one old woman, and I thought perhaps you could help me with the surplus." Elena smiled, genuinely touched by the offer. In the weeks since the funeral, Abigail Winters had become an unexpected presence in her life, dropping by with home-cooked meals, sitting with her through long afternoons, sharing stories about her 60-year marriage and the children she had raised. The friendship had developed naturally, born from the connection forged through Mike's final act of heroism and deepened by the strange experiences they had shared at his funeral. "That sounds wonderful," Elena replied. "But you don't need to. Come all this way. I can drive over." "Nonsense," Mrs. Winters interrupted firmly. "My grandson is visiting, and he's more than happy to bring me. That boy drives like he's being chased by the devil himself, but he'll get me there in one piece. Shall we say noon?" Elena agreed, knowing better than to argue with Mrs. Winters' gentle but unmovable determination. After hanging up, she made her way upstairs to shower and dress, moving carefully through the morning routine that had become increasingly challenging as her pregnancy advanced. In the nursery, she paused to straighten a stuffed animal in the crib, a Belgian Malinois plush toy that Captain Morris had given her, custom-made to resemble Shadow. The nursery itself was a testament to Mike's anticipation of fatherhood. He had painted it himself, installed the crib, arranged the changing table with meticulous attention to detail. Now it stood ready, but incomplete, waiting for a child who would never know their father except through stories and photographs. Elena sat in the rocking chair beside the window, feeling the baby shift and kick within her. "Your daddy was so excited to meet you," she whispered, her hand tracing circles on her belly. "He had so many plans, camping trips and baseball games and teaching you to ride a bike." Her voice caught on the last words, the grief still raw enough to steal her breath at unexpected moments. The baby kicked again, more forcefully this time, as if responding to her words, to the emotion in her voice. Elena closed her eyes, remembering the way Shadow had pressed his nose against her belly at the funeral. the way his behavior had changed in that moment, from desperate grief to something more purposeful, more protective. The memory brought with it another more unsettling recollection. Shadow's focused attention on empty spaces, his apparent recognition of something or someone that no one else could perceive. In the weeks since, she had caught him doing it occasionally, his head tilting toward vacant air, his ears pricking forward in that listening posture. It happened less frequently now, but when it did, Elena couldn't help wondering what he was experiencing, what presence he might be acknowledging. Mrs. Winters had her own theories, of course. During their afternoon visits, the elderly woman often spoke matter-of-factly about her beliefs regarding the continuation of consciousness beyond death, about the special sensitivity of animals to energies or presences that humans couldn't perceive. "They don't have our preconceptions," she had explained once, her gnarled hands wrapped around a teacup. "They simply respond to what is, not what we think should be." Elena wasn't sure what she believed. She had been raised with conventional, religious ideas about heaven and the afterlife, but those concepts had always seemed distant, abstract, more metaphorical than literal. Yet Shadow's behavior at the funeral and since had challenged her understanding in ways she couldn't easily dismiss. There had been such precision in his responses, such specific recognition in his posture and movements. The doorbell chimed again, pulling her from these thoughts. Checking her watch, Elena realized it was too early to be Mrs. Winters. Making her way carefully down the stairs, she peered through the peephole to see Dr. Levine, the department psychologist, standing on her porch. Elena hesitated before opening the door. She had politely but firmly rejected Dr. Levine's previous attempts to document Shadow's unusual behaviors, uncomfortable with the idea of turning their grief into a research subject. But there was no avoiding the conversation now. "Dr. Levine," she greeted, opening the door with a neutral expression. "This is unexpected." The psychologist offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, Elena. I was in the neighborhood for a department consultation and thought I might check in on you." She glanced past Elena into the house. "Is Shadow here? Officer Ramirez mentioned he's been doing well with the new arrangement." "He's actually out with Ramirez this morning," Elena replied, reluctantly stepping back to allow the psychologist to enter. "Training exercises with the cadets." Dr. Levine nodded, following Elena into the living room. "That's good to hear. Working dogs need mental stimulation, especially highly trained ones like Shadow." She settled into an armchair, her clinical gaze taking in the photographs on the mantel, the subtle signs of Mike's absence throughout the room. "And how are you doing? Getting close to your due date, I see." Elena lowered herself carefully onto the couch. "We're both healthy. That's what matters." The psychologist nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I know my interest in Shadow's behavior at the funeral might have seemed insensitive. That wasn't my intention. I was genuinely fascinated from both a professional and personal perspective." "Shadow isn't a research subject," Elena said, her voice firm despite her attempt at politeness. "What happened that day was private, personal." Dr. Levine leaned forward, her professional demeanor giving way to something more genuine. "Elena, I understand your protectiveness, but what Shadow displayed wasn't just grief or confusion. It was something extraordinary, something that might help us understand the depth of the bonds these animals form with their handlers and families." Before Elena could respond, a sound at the front door caught her attention. The distinctive scratch Shadow always made when returning from walks with Mike, his signal that they were home. But Shadow was with Ramirez, miles away at the training facility. Dr. Levine noticed her sudden stillness. "What is it?" Elena shook her head, listening. "Nothing. I thought I heard..." The sound came again, more insistent this time. Not imagination, not memory, present and real. Rising awkwardly from the couch, Elena moved toward the front door. Dr. Levine following with professional curiosity. The scratching sound continued, rhythmic and familiar. Exactly the pattern Shadow used. 3 quick scratches, a pause, then 2 more. Elena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob. The rational part of her mind insisted that Shadow was with Ramirez, that this must be some other animal, perhaps a squirrel or a neighbor's pet. But deeper instincts, the same ones that had been awakened watching Shadow at the funeral, pushed her forward. She opened the door to an empty porch. Dr. Levine stood beside her, both women staring at the vacant space before them. There were no animals in sight, no explanation for the sounds they had both clearly heard. That was odd, the psychologist said, her clinical detachment momentarily shaken. It sounded exactly like her words were cut short by a sudden gust of wind that swept across the porch, unusually focused and strong enough to rustle the potted plants flanking the door. Despite the bright morning sunshine, the air felt strangely cool, carrying with it a scent that caught Elena's breath, the faint but unmistakable trace of Mike's aftershave. Dr. Levine's expression changed, professional curiosity transforming into something more uncertain as she too caught the scent. "Is that?" Elena nodded, unable to speak as the familiar fragrance wrapped around them. Bergamot and cedar, the distinctive cologne Mike had worn daily throughout their marriage. The scent was impossibly present, impossibly specific, and utterly inexplicable on the still spring morning. As they stood frozen in the doorway, the baby kicked suddenly, forcefully enough to make Elena gasp, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. The movement was different from the gentle flutters and nudges she'd grown accustomed to, deliberate, almost responsive, as if the child were reacting to the same inexplicable presence that had announced itself with scratching sounds and familiar scents. Dr. Levine's clinical reserve had completely dissolved, her expression reflecting the same wonder and uncertainty that Elena felt. "I think," she said softly, "that perhaps there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in my psychology textbooks." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and mystery. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the scent dissipated, carried away by another gentle breeze that seemed to wrap around Elena before continuing down the street, like a touch transformed into wind. They stepped back inside, closing the door. On the empty porch, but not on the questions that had opened within them, Dr. Levine sank into the nearest chair, her professional framework visibly rearranging itself to accommodate what she had just experienced. "In all my years of practice," she said finally, "of studying grief and its manifestations, I've never—" She trailed off, looking at Elena with new understanding. "This is what Shadow was responding to, isn't it? At the funeral, at the cemetery." Elena nodded slowly, the confirmation both terrifying and comforting. "I think so. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's real or just how grief shapes itself when it's too big to carry." She rested both hands on her belly, where the baby had settled again. "But Shadow sees it, feels it, and sometimes I think I do too." What would happen next would challenge everything both women thought they understood about life, death, and the connections that bind us across that seemingly impenetrable boundary. The scratching at the door was just the beginning, a hesitant reaching across thresholds both literal and metaphysical, a communication that would continue to unfold in ways that would leave no doubt about the message being conveyed. Dr. Levine remained with Elena for nearly 2 hours after the inexplicable incident at the front door. Their conversation had evolved from the psychologist's initial professional curiosity about Shadow's behavior to something far more personal. An exchange between 2 women confronting experiences that defied conventional explanation. "I've counseled hundreds of officers and their families through grief," Dr. Levine admitted, absently turning her teacup in its saucer. I've heard countless stories about signs, about moments when the bereaved felt the presence of their loved ones. I always approached those experiences with compassionate skepticism, viewing them as comforting manifestations of the grieving mind. She looked up, meeting Elena's eyes directly. But this was different. This wasn't subjective. We both heard it. We both smelled it. Elena nodded, a strange calm having settled over her after the initial shock. "It's been happening since the funeral," she said quietly. "Little things at first, lights flickering when I talked about Mike, his favorite songs playing randomly on shuffle, objects moved from where I left them." She paused, considering whether to share the next detail. "And Shadow, he keeps watching empty spaces, especially in the nursery. He'll sit for hours, just staring at the corner near the crib, his ears moving like he's listening to someone. Talking." Dr. Levine leaned forward, her professional interest rekindled despite her shaken certainty. "The nursery, specifically? That's interesting." She hesitated, then asked more gently, "Did Mike finish setting up the nursery before?" "He did everything," Elena replied, her voice catching slightly. "Painted the walls, assembled the furniture, organized all the baby clothes by size and season. He was so excited, so prepared." She blinked back tears, remembering Mike's methodical attention to detail, the same precision he brought to his police work transformed into preparation for fatherhood. The night before the accident, he was installing a special nightlight that projects stars onto the ceiling. He said he wanted our baby to fall asleep under the same stars we camped beneath on our honeymoon. The psychologist nodded thoughtfully. Unfinished business is often discussed in grief literature, the idea that some part of us remains connected to incomplete projects, to promises unfulfilled. She set her teacup down, choosing her next words. Carefully, "If something of Mike's consciousness has persisted, and I can't believe I'm saying this as a scientist, it would make sense that his focus would be on you and the baby, on the future he was preparing for so carefully." Elena felt a flutter of movement from the baby, a gentle confirmation that seemed to coincide with their conversation. "So you think it's really him? Not just grief or wishful thinking or hormones, making me imagine things?" Dr. Levine spread her hands in a gesture of intellectual surrender. 3 weeks ago, I would have offered you a compassionate but firm explanation about the psychology of grief, about how our minds create comforting narratives during loss. Her expression softened. "Now? I don't know, Elena. What happened at the door was real. What I witnessed with Shadow at the funeral was real. And perhaps there are aspects of consciousness, of connection, that persist beyond what we understand scientifically." The conversation might have continued indefinitely, both women finding unexpected comfort in sharing their challenged worldviews. But the arrival of Mrs. Winters and her grandson at precisely noon brought a natural conclusion. Dr. Levine departed with a promise to return, her clinical distance permanently altered by what she had experienced. Mrs. Winters, perceptive as always, noticed Elena's unusual energy immediately. "Something's happened," she observed, as her grandson carried containers of homemade soup to the kitchen. "Your aura is different today." Elena had grown accustomed to Mrs. Winters' occasional metaphysical observations, accepting them as part of the elderly woman's unique perspective. But after the morning's events, the comment struck her differently. "Is that something you can actually see? Auras?" Mrs. Winters settled into what had become her usual chair by the window, arranging her shawl around her shoulders despite the warmth of the spring day. "Not see, exactly. Sense. It's something that developed after my near-death experience in the fire." She studied Elena with gentle curiosity. "You've had a visitor, haven't you? Not the human kind." The directness of the question startled Elena. "How did you know?" "The energy in the house is different." Mrs. Winters glanced around the living room, her aged eyes seeming to track something invisible to Elena. And your energy has shifted. There's less heaviness, more anticipation. She smiled, the expression transforming her wrinkled face with surprising youth. Tell me what happened. Elena described the morning's events, the scratching at the door, the unexplainable scent of Mike's cologne, Dr. Levine's shaken scientific certainty. As she spoke, Mrs. Winters nodded occasionally, her expression unsurprised, as if Elena were simply confirming what she already knew. The veil thins sometimes, the elderly woman said when Elena had finished. Between their world and ours. Animals notice it first, they always do. They don't have our stubbornness about what's possible and what isn't. She reached out, patting Elena's hand with fingers gnarled by arthritis, but still strong. Your shadow has been your guide, showing you what's possible, but now you're beginning to perceive it directly. But why? Elena asked, the question encompassing more than she could articulate. Why now? Why these signs? Why the persistence of connection when the physical presence was so irrevocably gone? Mrs. Winters seemed to understand the complexity behind the simple word. Love doesn't end, dear. It changes form like water to vapor. Still present, still real, just differently arranged. She glanced toward the front door. And some souls are more determined than others. Your Mike was stubborn in life, wasn't he? Persistent when something mattered to him? Elena smiled despite herself, remembering Mike's legendary determination. He once spent 3 days tracking a missing child through a state park during a snowstorm. When the search was officially called off, he and Shadow continued anyway. They found her alive in an abandoned ranger station. That kind of determination doesn't simply vanish, Mrs. Winters said with quiet certainty, and nothing mattered more to him than you and your child. The baby kicked vigorously as if in agreement, making Elena wince slightly. Mrs. Winters noticed immediately. Active today, isn't he? The elderly woman observed. Elena raised an eyebrow. He. Did Shadow tell you the gender? Because we decided not to find out. Mrs. Winters smiled mysteriously. Just a feeling. When you've lived as long as I have, you develop intuitions about these things. She changed the subject smoothly. When is Shadow due back from his training? Around 4, Elena replied, checking her watch. Ramirez texted earlier to say everything was going well. They're working on some advanced tracking scenarios with the new cadets. Mrs. Winters nodded approvingly. Good. Shadow needs that balance. His police work and his time with you. It honors both sides of his bond with Mike. She paused, then added more gently. And it's healthy for you to have some independence too. Your relationship with the baby will be its own kind of intense bond. They spent the afternoon in comfortable companionship, sharing soup and conversation that drifted from practical preparations for the baby's arrival to Mrs. Winters' memories of raising her own children. Through it all, Elena found herself increasingly aware of subtle shifts in the energy of the house, slight temperature changes, the occasional flicker of lights, moments when the baby's movements seemed to respond to topics of conversation. At precisely 3:30, Shadow's special ringtone sounded from Elena's phone, an alert Ramirez had set up to notify her when they were heading back from training. She answered immediately, expecting the officer's usual brief update. Instead, Ramirez's voice came through tense and urgent. Elena, we're heading your way now, but something's happened. Shadow's fine, he added quickly, but he's behaving strangely. We were in the middle of a training exercise when he suddenly broke protocol, just took off running toward the parking lot. I couldn't call him back. Elena felt a cold knot of concern form in her stomach. Shadow breaking training protocols was virtually unprecedented. His discipline was foundational to his entire identity as a K-9 officer. What happened next? He went straight to the SUV and started scratching at the door, barking. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't respond to any commands. I've never seen him like this. so I decided to bring him home early. We're about 20 minutes out." Mrs. Winters, who could hear the concern in Elena's voice, moved closer, her expression questioning. Elena covered the phone briefly to explain the situation. "When exactly did this behavior start?" Mrs. Winters asked, her voice sharper than usual. Elena relayed the question to Ramirez. "About 20 minutes ago," he replied after a moment's consideration. "Around 3:15, I'd say. We were in the middle of an article search when he just changed. 1 second, he was completely focused on the training scenario. The next, he was racing toward the parking lot like something was chasing him." Elena and Mrs. Winters exchanged significant glances. 3:15, exactly when they had been discussing Mike's dedication to preparing the nursery, when the baby had begun kicking with unusual vigor. "Bring him home as quickly as you can," Elena told Ramirez, unable to explain her sudden sense of urgency. "But drive safely." After ending the call, she turned to Mrs. Winters, whose expression had grown serious, almost concerned. "You don't think it's a coincidence?" Elena said. "It wasn't a question." "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," the elderly woman replied, rising from her chair with the help of her cane. "Not since the fire. Not since your husband carried me through smoke so thick it should have killed us both." She moved toward the front window, looking out at the quiet residential street. Shadow sensed something important enough to break his training. They waited in tense silence, both women watching through the window for Ramirez's SUV. When it finally appeared, turning sharply into the driveway, Shadow was already visible through the passenger window, standing rather than sitting, his posture alert, his attention fixed on the house. Ramirez had barely brought the vehicle to a complete stop before Shadow began scratching frantically at the window, the same distinctive pattern Elena had heard at the front door earlier. 3 quick scratches. A pause, then 2 more. "That's the same sound," she whispered to Mrs. Winters. "Exactly the same," the elderly woman nodded, her expression focused. "He's trying to tell you something urgent." Ramirez opened the passenger door, and Shadow bolted from the vehicle with unusual speed, racing toward the front door with single-minded determination. The officer followed, clearly concerned by the canine's uncharacteristic behavior. Elena opened the door before Shadow could begin scratching. The Belgian Malinois burst inside, his usual disciplined entrance replaced by what appeared to be desperate urgency. He circled Elena once, sniffing intensely, then shocked everyone by doing something he had never done before. He took her sleeve gently in his teeth and tugged, trying to lead her toward the stairs. "What on earth?" Ramirez began, entering the house just in time to witness this unprecedented behavior. Mrs. Winters watched with knowing eyes. "He wants you to follow him, dear. I think you should." Shadow maintained his gentle but insistent grip on Elena's sleeve, tugging again toward the staircase. His amber eyes locked with hers, communicating an urgency that transcended language. Elena nodded slightly, allowing Shadow to guide her toward the stairs. "I'm coming, boy. Show me what's wrong." The K9 released her sleeve and moved quickly to the staircase, looking back repeatedly to ensure she was following. His behavior was nothing like his usual methodical police work. This was something more primal, more instinctive. Elena followed as quickly as her pregnancy would allow, with Mrs. Winters and Ramirez close behind. At the top of the stairs, Shadow didn't hesitate. He headed directly for the nursery, pushing the half-open door with his nose and entering the carefully prepared room that awaited the arrival of Mike's child. Inside, everything appeared exactly as Elena had left it that morning. The freshly made crib, the changing table stocked with supplies, the rocking chair positioned precisely where the morning light would fall. Yet Shadow behaved as if he'd discovered something critically important. He moved to the center of the room, turning in a tight circle, then sat down and released 3 short, sharp barks. His alert signal, the one he used during police operations to indicate he had found what he was searching for. "What is it, boy?" Elena asked, scanning the room for anything unusual. What are you trying to show us? Shadow barked once more, then rose and moved to the corner near the crib, the exact spot where Elena had often observed him watching empty space. He sat again, his posture formal and alert, his gaze fixed on what appeared to be nothing but empty air. Ramirez looked bewildered, his professional understanding of canine behavior insufficient to explain what he was witnessing. "I've never seen him act like this," he said quietly. "It's like he's responding to a handler, but the handler isn't visible to us," Mrs. Winters finished for him, her voice calm with understanding. "Only to Shadow." As they watched in stunned silence, Shadow's behavior became even more extraordinary. He shifted from his sitting position to a formal down, then rolled to his side, a specific sequence of movements that Elena recognized immediately. "That's his bomb detection protocol," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. Mike trained him to do that sequence when he found explosives. Down, then roll away to minimize the impact if something detonated. Ramirez nodded, his police training allowing him to recognize the behavior pattern, despite his confusion about its context. But there's nothing there. We'd have alarms, sensors. The whole house would be monitored by the department after Mike's death. Shadow remained in the rolled position for precisely 3 seconds, the protocol duration, before rising smoothly to his feet again. He returned to Elena's side, pressing against her legs with unusual emphasis, then looked up at her with an intensity that seemed to communicate something beyond instinct or training. The room had grown inexplicably cold, despite the warm spring afternoon. Elena felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she tried to make sense of Shadow's behavior, of the sequence he had just performed with such precision. Mrs. Winters moved forward, her cane tapping softly on the hardwood floor. "I think," she said carefully, "that Shadow just delivered a message, a very specific one." The baby kicked suddenly, so forcefully that Elena gasped, her hands cradling her belly. The movement was different from anything she'd felt before. Not the usual gentle tumbling or stretching, but a sharp, deliberate pressure, almost like a warning. And in that moment, standing in the carefully prepared nursery, with Shadow pressed protectively against her legs, Elena understood with absolute clarity what was happening. The scratching at the door that morning, Shadow's abrupt departure from training, the bomb detection sequence, the baby's unusual movements. "We need to leave the house," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline suddenly coursing through her. "Right now." Ramirez looked startled. "What? Why?" "Shadow's trying to warn us. Something's wrong with the house. Something dangerous." Her certainty was absolute, built from pieces that had seemed disconnected until this moment. Shadow's behavior, the strange phenomena she'd been experiencing, the persistence of a presence that seemed determined to communicate. Mrs. Winters nodded in immediate agreement, already moving toward the stairs with surprising speed for her age. "Trust the dog," she said simply, "and trust what you know in your heart." Ramirez hesitated, torn between his rational police training and the inexplicable but compelling evidence before him. Shadow's behavior was unlike anything in the K9 handler. Manual, yet it followed clear patterns of trained responses, patterns designed specifically for danger detection. "I'm calling it in," he decided, reaching for his radio. "We'll evacuate now, then get a sweep team out here. Better safe than sorry." As they made their way downstairs, Shadow maintained his protective position beside Elena, his body language communicating continued urgency. At the front door, he paused, looking back toward the nursery one last time, his ears moving in that now familiar pattern of listening to something beyond human perception. Outside, in the safety of the front yard, Ramirez made the necessary calls, while Mrs. Winters helped Elena to a garden bench, the elderly woman's usual fragility temporarily set aside in the face of potential danger. Shadow remained standing, his attention divided between Elena and the house, his posture alert, but no longer panicked. Whatever urgency had driven his extraordinary behavior appeared to have been satisfied by their evacuation. "What do you think it is?" Elena asked, not entirely sure who she was addressing. Mrs. Winters, Ramirez, or perhaps someone else entirely. Someone present in ways she was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Winters placed a gnarled hand over Eleanor's, her touch surprisingly warm and strong. "I think someone who loves you very much is still watching over you, still protecting his family. Even now, as police vehicles began to arrive, lights flashing but sirens respectfully silent in the residential neighborhood, Shadow finally sat beside Elena, his mission apparently complete. His amber eyes remained fixed on the house, watchful and attentive, but the desperate urgency had faded into something calmer, something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. What the emergency response team would discover inside the Sullivan home would confirm beyond any doubt the message Shadow had been tasked with delivering, a message that transcended the boundaries between worlds, between life and death, between what was possible and what was real, a message driven by the most powerful force of all. A father's determination to protect his child, a husband's refusal to leave his final watch, even after death had claimed him. The specialized hazmat team arrived within 15 minutes of Ramirez's call, their response accelerated by the mention of a potential threat at a fallen officer's residence. 2 unmarked vans and a command vehicle pulled up in front of the Sullivan home, disgorging technicians in specialized gear who approached the house with professional caution. Lieutenant Marquez, head of the department's Hazardous Devices Unit, and a close colleague of Mike's, immediately approached Elena, where she sat in the patrol vehicle Ramirez had guided her to. "Mrs. Sullivan," he greeted her, his expression grave beneath his regulation cap. "Officer Ramirez says Shadow alerted to something in the nursery, a potential explosive device?" Elena nodded, one hand resting on Shadow's head where the dog sat, vigilantly beside her. "It's going to sound crazy," she began, but Shadow performed his bomb detection sequence in the nursery, the specific protocol Mike trained him for, but there was nothing visible there. Marquez glanced at Shadow, professional respect evident in his assessment of the K-9 officer. "Shadow's detection rate is nearly perfect. If he alerted, there's something there, visible or not." He turned to Ramirez. "What exactly triggered his behavior?" Ramirez described the afternoon's events, Shadow's abrupt departure from training, his frantic return to the house, the precise sequence of movements in the nursery. As he spoke, Marquez's expression shifted from professional concern to deep concentration. "The corner by the crib specifically," he confirmed, making notes on his tablet. Elena nodded. "Yes, the exact spot where Shadow has been watching empty space for weeks now." If Marquez found this detail strange, he gave no indication. Working with highly trained detection dogs had taught him to respect their perceptions without necessarily understanding them. "We'll start there. The team will conduct a full sweep, but we'll focus on that location first." As Marquez returned to coordinate the search, Captain Morris arrived, having been notified of the situation through department channels. His face showed immediate concern as he approached Elena. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he felt toward Mike's widow and unborn child. "I'm fine," Elena assured him, "just confused and a little scared. This all seems so..." She trailed off, unable to find words to encompass the strangeness of the situation. Morris nodded in understanding. "Marquez is the best we have. If there's anything to find, they'll find it." He glanced at Shadow, who remained calm but alert beside Elena. And Shadow's never given a false positive, not once in his service record. They waited in tense silence as the hazmat team entered the house, their movements methodical and precise. Mrs. Winters had been escorted to a neighbor's residence for safety, though she had departed reluctantly, insisting she wanted to see how the message was delivered. Nearly 30 minutes after they had entered, Marquez emerged from the house, his expression transformed from professional neutrality to something more complex, a mixture of disbelief and grim confirmation. He approached Elena and the officers directly, removing his protective helmet as he came. "You need to see this," he said simply. "It's safe now." Escorted by Marquez and Morris, with Shadow leading the way as if he already knew what they would find, Elena re-entered her home. The entry and living room showed signs of the team's systematic search. Furniture slightly displaced, cushions removed and not yet replaced. But Marquez led them directly upstairs to the nursery, where several technicians stood in a tight cluster around the corner Shadow had indicated. "We found it exactly where you described," Marquez explained, guiding Elena carefully into the room. Shadow's alert was precise. In the corner near the crib, partially concealed inside the wall, the team had uncovered a small electronic device. Its housing had been removed, exposing a primitive circuit board connected to wires that extended into the electrical system of the house. "What is it?" Elena asked, instinctively placing a protective hand over her belly. Marquez's expression grew, carefully neutral, the look of a professional delivering difficult information. "It's a remote-triggered incendiary device. Crude, but effective. It was wired into the electrical line that powers the baby monitor and nightlight." He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Once activated, it would have created an electrical overload leading to a fire that would have started right here, in the nursery. Elena felt her knees weaken, gratefully accepting Captain Morris's steadying hand on her elbow. "But why would anyone?" "We have a theory," Morris said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 weeks before Mike's accident, he testified against Martin Kazan in the West Side arson case. Kazan was convicted largely based on Mike and Shadow's evidence. They found accelerant traces that linked him to 3 fires that killed 5 people. Marquez nodded grimly. Kazan was transferred to the state psychiatric facility last month after claiming diminished capacity. He escaped during a medical transport 2 days before Mike's accident. "Are you saying this man had something to do with Mike's death?" Elena asked, the room suddenly spinning around her. "We don't know yet," Morris admitted. "The drunk driver who hit Mike checked out. Just a college kid who made a terrible mistake. But this," he gestured to the device, "this has Kazan's signature, the same type of remote trigger he used in the West Side fires." "The device appears to have been installed recently," Marquez added. "Within the last month, based on the dust patterns and wiring condition. Our theory is that Kazan was planning revenge against Mike for his testimony. When Mike died in the accident, Kazan may have decided to target his family instead." Shadow had moved to the exact spot where the device had been concealed, sitting at perfect attention, his gaze moving between Elena and the exposed wiring, as if confirming the connection between his alert and their discovery. "But how did Shadow know?" Ramirez asked, giving voice to the question everyone was struggling with. "We've swept this house weekly since Mike's death, standard procedure for an officer's residence during a mourning period. Shadow's been in this room dozens of times in the past 3 weeks. Why alert today specifically?" Elena knew the answer, though she hesitated to voice it among the collection of practical, evidence-driven police officers. But the reality of the device they had discovered gave her courage to speak what she had come to believe. "He was told," she said simply. "Mike told him." The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their professional training at odds with the inexplicable circumstances they were witnessing. Marquez busied himself with his tablet, avoiding direct engagement with Elena's statement. Morris looked thoughtful rather than dismissive, his decades of police work having exposed him to enough unexplainable situations to leave room for possibilities beyond standard procedures. Ramirez, however, found himself nodding slowly. "The timing," he said. "Shadow broke from training at exactly 3:15. That's when Mrs. Winters asked Elena about the nursery, about Mike finishing it before his death." Morris raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything." "Sir," Ramirez replied carefully, "I'm just stating facts. Shadow has been behaving strangely since the funeral. We've all seen it. Today, he abandoned training exercises mid-scenario, something I've never seen him do, and performed a specific alert sequence in exactly the spot where we found a device that none of our regular sweeps detected." He paused, meeting his captains. "Gaze directly. I don't have an explanation that fits department protocols. I just know what I saw." Shadow had moved from his position by the wall to stand beside Elena, pressing against her leg in that now familiar protective gesture. His behavior had completely normalized, the urgency and distress replaced by his usual calm vigilance. "Whatever. Or whoever guided Shadow to this," Marquez said pragmatically. "We're grateful. This device was designed to activate remotely. It could have been triggered at any time, day or night." He glanced at Elena's pregnant belly, leaving unspoken the most horrifying aspect of the situation, that the device had been placed specifically to harm Mike's child. As the team continued their methodical search of the house, ensuring no other devices had been planted, Elena found herself drawn to the window of the nursery. Outside, spring sunlight illuminated the backyard, where Mike had planned to build a swing set, where he had imagined teaching their child to play catch, to identify birds, to watch for shooting stars on summer nights. Shadow joined her at the window, his warm presence a counterbalance to the chill that had settled in her chest with the realization of how close she had come to losing everything. Again, she placed one hand on his head, drawing comfort from the solid reality of him, while her other hand cradled her belly where Mike's child grew, protected and safe. "Thank you," she whispered, the words directed not just to Shadow, but to the presence she now firmly believed had guided him, had scratched at the door that morning, had created that distinctive scent of cologne from nothing. "Thank you for still watching over us." Shadow looked up at her, then back out the window, his ears moving in that now familiar pattern of listening to something beyond human hearing range. His tail wagged once, gently, an acknowledgement of something or someone that remained invisible to all but him. Captain Morris approached quietly, respecting the moment he was witnessing without fully understanding it. "Elena," he said gently, "we need to relocate you until we complete a full investigation. The house isn't safe until we're certain Kazan hasn't left any other surprises." She nodded, unsurprised by the recommendation. "Where will we go, officer?" "Chen has a guest house on his property," Morris explained. "It's secure, on department grounds, and it has everything you'll need until the baby comes. His wife is a nurse. She's already volunteered to help when the time comes." The offer was both practical and touching, a reminder of the extended family that had embraced her through Mike's service, and now his absence. "Thank you," she said simply. "Shadow and I would appreciate that." As they prepared to leave the house, gathering the essentials Elena would need for an extended stay, Lieutenant Marquez pulled Morris aside for a private conversation. Elena couldn't hear their exchange, but the grave expressions on both men's faces suggested the discovery in the nursery had opened new and troubling questions about Mike's death. Questions that might transform what had appeared to be a tragic accident into something far more sinister. Shadow stayed close to Elena throughout the process, his earlier distress completely replaced by focused attentiveness. Whatever mission had driven his extraordinary behavior appeared to have been accomplished. The warning had been delivered, the danger averted. Yet he remained watchful, professional, the perfect synthesis of his dual identity as both a highly trained police K9 and a devoted family guardian. As they were escorted to the waiting patrol car, Elena paused on the front porch, looking back at the home she and Mike had shared, the home where they had planned to raise their child, the home that had almost become a crime scene for a second time. "We'll find him," Morris promised, correctly interpreting her backward glance. "Kazan won't get anywhere near you or the baby. You have my word." Elena nodded, grateful for the captain's reassurance, but aware that her protection extended beyond the visible officers surrounding her. The events of the day had confirmed what she had sensed since the funeral, that Mike's commitment to his family, his dedication to their safety, had somehow transcended his physical death. "I know," she said simply, her hand finding Shadow's fur as they descended the porch steps together. Behind them, unnoticed by the collection of practical, evidence-driven police officers, the porch light flickered twice, a signal Mike and Elena had used during his nighttime shifts, his way of letting her know he had arrived safely home. A small gesture, easily dismissed as an electrical fluctuation by those inclined toward rational explanations. But Shadow noticed. He paused, looking back at the light, his ears pricking forward in recognition. Then, with a soft exhale that sounded almost like satisfaction, he continued forward, guiding Elena toward whatever would come next in their unexpected journey, a journey now marked by mystery and danger, but also by a love powerful enough to reach across the ultimate boundary. If this story of unbreakable bonds and protection beyond death touches your heart, please like and subscribe. The truth of what happened to Officer Sullivan and the extraordinary connection between Shadow, Elena, and their unseen guardian is about to be revealed in ways no one could have anticipated. Officer Chen's guest house proved to be a perfect sanctuary. Situated at the back of his property behind a tall privacy fence and monitored by state-of-the-art security systems, the small two-bedroom cottage offered both safety and comfort. Chen's wife, May, a labor and delivery nurse at Chicago Memorial, had prepared the space with thoughtful attention to Elena's advanced pregnancy. Extra pillows, a freezer stocked with meals, a comfortable rocking chair positioned by the window overlooking the garden. Shadow adapted to the new environment with his usual professional flexibility, conducting a thorough inspection of the perimeter before settling into a routine of vigilant observation. He claimed a spot by the front door where he could monitor both entrances while keeping Elena in his line of sight, a position that balanced security needs with his evident desire to remain close to her. 3 days after the discovery of the incendiary device, Captain Morris arrived with Lieutenant Marquez and Dr. Levine. The unusual combination of visitors immediately alerted Elena that this wasn't a routine check-in. "We have updates," Morris explained as they settled in the small living room. "Some of it confirmatory, some of it—" He hesitated, glancing at Dr. Levine. "More difficult to categorize." Marquez opened his tablet, his expression serious. "The device we found matches Kazan's methodology exactly. Same wiring pattern, same trigger mechanism. We've confirmed it was installed approximately 2 weeks ago based on dust patterns and material analysis." "So, after Mike died," Elena said softly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Yes, and we've found something else." Marquez swiped his screen, bringing up a surveillance image. "This was captured by your neighbor's security camera 10 days ago. The system only retains footage for 2 weeks, which is why we didn't have it during our initial sweep." The grainy image showed a thin man approaching the Sullivan home at 2:17 a.m., a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Even with the poor quality, the resemblance to Martin Kazan's prison photo was unmistakable. "It's him," Elena whispered, a chill running through her despite the warm spring day. "He was in our home while I was sleeping." Shadow, who had been resting beside Elena's chair, rose immediately at the distress in her voice. He pressed against her leg, providing silent support as he had so many times since Mike's death. "We've escalated the search," Morris assured her. "Every available officer knows his face. He won't get far." Dr. Levine, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "There's another element to this situation that I feel needs to be addressed," she said carefully. "Something that goes beyond standard police procedure." Morris nodded, giving the psychologist permission to continue despite his evident discomfort with the direction the conversation was taking. "I've spoken with Officer Ramirez extensively about Shadow's behavior at the training facility," Dr. Levine explained, turning to Elena. "And I've interviewed Mrs. Winters about her experiences both during the fire and at Mike's funeral." She paused, choosing her words with professional precision. "Based on the evidence, and I use that term deliberately, I believe we're dealing with a phenomenon that extends beyond conventional understanding." Elena felt a strange calm settle over her, a validation of what she had already come to believe. "You're talking about Mike, about his presence somehow continuing?" Dr. Levine nodded, her clinical reserve softening. "In my 20 years of practice, I've approached grief manifestations as psychological phenomena, comforting narratives the mind creates to process loss. But what we've witnessed with Shadow, with the device discovery, with the multiple corroborated experiences," she spread her hands in a gesture of intellectual surrender. "There's a pattern of intervention here that defies conventional explanation." Marquez shifted uncomfortably, his evidence-based training at odds with the conversation. "I'm just focused on finding Kazan," he said, redirecting to more familiar territory. "Whatever or whoever guided Shadow to that device, I'm grateful. But our priority has to be the tangible threat." "They're connected," Elena said with quiet certainty. "Mike's presence and Kazan's threat. I think..." She hesitated, aware of how it might sound to these practical, procedure-driven officers. "I think Mike knows something about his death that we don't. I think that's why he's still here, still trying to communicate." Morris exchanged glances with Marquez, a silent communication passing between them. "We've reopened the investigation into Mike's accident," the captain admitted. "The timing, Kazan's escape just days before Mike was killed, the targeting of your home afterward. It's too coincidental." "You think Kazan was responsible for Mike's death?" Elena asked, her mind racing to connect these new possibilities. "We don't know yet," Morris replied honestly. "The college student who hit Mike's car has a clean record, no connection to Kazan. That we can find. His blood alcohol level was genuinely elevated. His remorse appears genuine, but we're looking deeper now. Kazan had connections, people who owed him favors. The collision might have been arranged." Shadow's behavior changed subtly as Morris spoke. His ears moved in that now familiar pattern of attentive listening, his gaze fixed on the empty space near the doorway. Elena had come to recognize these moments. Shadow perceiving something, someone, beyond ordinary human awareness. Dr. Levine noticed immediately. "He's doing it again," she observed quietly. The same response pattern from the funeral. All eyes turned to Shadow, who remained focused on the doorway, his posture alert but not alarmed. After several seconds, he stood and moved deliberately to Elena's side, pressing against her leg as if providing support for what was to come. "I think," Dr. Levine said carefully, "that we may have a corroborating witness to this conversation." Morris, despite his decades of practical police work, found himself watching the empty doorway with unconscious intensity. If Mike's trying to tell us something about his death, about Kazan, we need to understand it. He turned to Dr. Levine. "Doctor, in your research on these phenomena, is there any precedent for more direct communication?" The psychologist nodded slowly. There are documented cases of communication through objects, through electrical devices, patterns of interaction that seem deliberate rather than random. She glanced at Shadow, still pressed against Elena's leg. And animals often serve as intermediaries. Their perception isn't limited by our preconceptions. Marquez, the most skeptical of the group, nonetheless found himself drawn into the possibility. So, how do we proceed? This isn't exactly covered in the investigative handbook. Before anyone could respond, Elena's phone rang, the distinctive tone she had assigned to Officer Ramirez. She answered immediately, placing the call on speaker. "Elena," Ramirez's voice came through, tight with controlled urgency. "We've got something. The traffic cameras from the night of Mike's accident. The tech team enhanced the footage." He paused, background voices indicating he was in a busy command center. There was a second vehicle involved, a dark van that pulled out in front of the college student's car, forcing him to swerve into Mike's lane. The van left the scene immediately. The room fell silent as the implications of this new information settled. Shadow's ears pricked forward at the sound of Ramirez's voice, his attention intensifying. "We've identified the van," Ramirez continued. "It was reported stolen the day before the accident and abandoned 10 miles from the crash site. But the tech team found something else, a partial fingerprint on the door handle. It's a match for one of Kazan's known associates, a former cellmate named Victor Resnick." Elena felt her breath catch, her hands instinctively cradling her belly as the pieces began to align. Mike's death hadn't been an accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated assassination disguised as a drunk driving incident, with the unsuspecting college student serving as an unwitting weapon. "Where's Resnick now?" Morris demanded, already on his feet. "In custody as of 20 minutes ago," Ramirez replied, "picked up at a motel outside Rockford. He's not talking yet, but we found a prepaid phone in his possession with calls to a number we believe belongs to Kazan." As the implications of this revelation rippled through the room, Shadow suddenly moved from Elena's side to the center of the small living area. With deliberate precision, he performed a sequence of movements that every officer present immediately recognized, the specific tracking pattern used when following a suspect's trail. "What's he doing?" Marquez asked, watching the dog's methodical movements. Elena leaned forward, her attention completely focused on Shadow. "It's Mike's training sequence for suspect tracking, the exact pattern they used when following a high-value target." Shadow completed the sequence, then sat at perfect attention, looking directly at Captain Morris as if awaiting orders. The room fell silent again, the practical, evidence-driven officers confronted with behavior that challenged their professional frameworks, but couldn't be dismissed. "I think," Dr. Levine said quietly, "that we're receiving very specific guidance." Morris nodded slowly, decades of police experience wrestling with the inexplicable scene before him. "Ramirez," he said into the phone, his decision made. "Bring in the K9 unit, all of them. I want them at the command center in 30 minutes. We're going to try something unconventional." As the call ended, Morris turned to Elena. "With your permission, I'd like Shadow to assist in the search for Kazan. Not just as a standard K9 unit, but as..." He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't compromise his professional standing, as a resource with unique insights into this situation. Elena understood immediately what Morris was proposing, an acknowledgement that Shadow's connection to Mike, whatever its nature, might provide their best chance of locating Kazan before he could attempt another attack. "Of course," she agreed, looking down at Shadow, who remained in his alert position. "But I'm coming too. I need to be there." Morris began to object, citing her advanced pregnancy and the potential danger, but Dr. Levine interrupted. "I think Elena's presence may be essential," the psychologist said, her professional assessment cutting through Morris's protests. If we're accepting the premise that Shadow is somehow receiving guidance from Mike, then the connection is strongest when both Shadow and Elena are present. The nursery incident demonstrated that clearly. Marquez, still struggling with the unconventional direction of the investigation, but unable to dismiss the evidence before him, nodded reluctantly. We can secure a command position for Mrs. Sullivan. Completely safe, fully monitored. As the details were arranged, Shadow remained focused and alert, his behavior having shifted from the emotional distress that had marked the funeral to something more purposeful, more directed. Whatever connection existed between the K-9 officer and his deceased handler had evolved into something unprecedented in police work, a partnership that somehow continued beyond death itself, driven by a singular purpose: to protect the family Mike had left behind. The command center buzzed with controlled urgency as officers coordinated the search for Martin Kazan. Large monitors displayed maps of the city, surveillance feeds, and real-time updates from field units. Elena sat in a secured area, a tactical vest draped awkwardly over her pregnant belly, despite her insistence that it was unnecessary. Shadow remained at her side, calmer than anyone might have expected, his attention periodically shifting to empty spaces with that now familiar recognition. Captain Morris had briefed the assembled K-9 teams with remarkable straightforwardness. We're following Shadow's lead on this one. Whatever he alerts to, wherever he indicates, we trust it, no questions asked. If the officers found this approach unusual, their respect for both Morris and Shadow kept any skepticism in check. Resnick had finally broken under interrogation, revealing that Kazan had become obsessed with revenge against Officer Sullivan after his testimony had secured a life sentence. Mike wasn't supposed to die in the crash, Resnick had admitted. Kazan wanted him injured, vulnerable. The plan was to finish him in the hospital, make it look like medical complications. But when the collision proved fatal, Kazan had redirected. His vengeance toward Mike's unborn child, the legacy he had so eagerly anticipated. We've narrowed Kazan's likely location to the industrial district, Lieutenant Marquez announced, highlighting a section of the city map. Thermal imaging shows activity in 3 abandoned warehouses that should be empty. As the tactical teams prepared to deploy, Shadow suddenly stood, his posture transforming into focused alertness. Without warning, he approached the large map display, placing his paw directly on a building several blocks from the highlighted area, a location that hadn't been part of their search parameters. That's the old Westland paper factory, Officer Chen identified immediately. It's been scheduled for demolition for months. Marquez looked skeptical. That's outside our search grid. The thermal scans didn't show any heat signatures there. Because the basement levels are lead-lined, Dr. Levine interjected, surprising everyone with her practical knowledge. It was a Cold War-era facility. They built radiation shelters beneath it. Shadow barked once, the sharp sound cutting through the momentary hesitation. His certainty was unequivocal, a trained response that every K-9 handler in the room recognized as absolute conviction. Redirect teams to the Westland facility, Morris ordered without further debate. Full tactical approach, assume subject is armed and anticipating pursuit. As units deployed, Elena felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere around her, a subtle change in temperature, in pressure, that she had come to associate with Mike's presence. Shadow felt it too, his ears rotating backward briefly before focusing forward again with renewed intensity. "He's close," she whispered to Dr. Levine. "Mike is very present right now." The psychologist nodded, her scientific skepticism permanently altered by what she had witnessed over the past weeks. "I think he's been guiding this entire investigation," she replied quietly. "The device in the nursery, Shadow's behavior at training, now this specific location, it's not random, it's directed." The tactical teams reported reaching the Westland facility, their helmet cameras displaying the decaying industrial complex on the command center screens. Shadow watched the footage with unnerving focus, occasionally shifting position as if responding to unseen cues. "Basement access located," crackled a voice over the comm system. Proceeding with entry. The tension in the command center peaked as the teams descended into the subterranean levels of the old factory. Shadow had moved to press against Elena's legs, his body angled protectively as they watched the operation unfold on the monitors. "Movement detected," reported the team leader. "Southeast corner behind the old furnace system." The thermal imaging suddenly flickered to life, revealing a heat signature precisely where Shadow had indicated on the map. The cameras showed a gaunt figure huddled in the shadows, something clutched in his hands. The unmistakable silhouette of Martin Kazan, holding what appeared to be a detonator. "Subject is armed with a potential explosive device," the team leader reported, his voice professionally calm despite the escalating danger, requesting EOD support and negotiator. As the situation developed into a standoff, Shadow suddenly tensed, his attention fixing on the empty space beside Elena's chair. Without warning, he gave 3 short, sharp barks, the precise signal Mike had trained him to use when indicating a critical development during operations. Every monitor in the command center flickered simultaneously, their displays momentarily disrupted by what technicians would later attribute to an unexplained power surge. When the screen stabilized, the cameras showed Kazan looking upward in evident panic, reacting to something above him that wasn't visible in the camera angle. "Water main breach," reported a confused tactical officer. "The ceiling pipes are rupturing." The decades-old sprinkler system had spontaneously activated, drenching Kazan and, crucially, the improvised detonator in his hands. The tactical team seized the moment of confusion, neutralizing the threat with practiced efficiency. "Subject in custody," came the report minutes later. "Device secured by EOD. No casualties." Relief flooded the command center, officers exchanging handshakes and subdued congratulations. But Elena's attention remained fixed on Shadow, who had shifted to a position of formal rest, his mission apparently complete. His amber eyes tracked something moving across the room, something that passed directly over the city map, paused briefly beside Elena's chair, then seemed to dissipate entirely. In that moment, Shadow's demeanor transformed. The vigilant tension he had carried since Mike's death eased visibly, his posture softening from alert readiness to a more natural calm. He looked up at Elena, then at her swollen belly, before settling at her feet with a deep sigh that sounded remarkably like completion. 2 weeks later, Elena went into labor. With Mrs. Winters holding one hand and Dr. Levine the other, she delivered a healthy boy whose first cries were accompanied by the hospital lights flickering briefly, a momentary surge that the staff attributed to ordinary electrical fluctuations. Shadow, who had been permitted into the hospital through special arrangement by Captain Morris, stood at perfect attention beside the delivery bed. As the newborn was placed in Elena's arms, the Belgian Malinois approached carefully, his nose gently touching the baby's tiny hand in a gesture of introduction and acceptance. They named him Michael, after his father, but his middle name was Shadow, honoring the extraordinary partnership that had transcended the ultimate boundary to protect both mother and child from harm. And sometimes in the quiet hours of night, when young Michael sleeps in his crib, Elena notices Shadow sitting alert beside him, his ears moving in that familiar pattern of recognition, his amber eyes tracking something unseen yet undeniably present. A father's love, a partner's loyalty, a connection that not even death had the power to sever. In the quiet dawn of Michael Shadow Sullivan's 3rd birthday, Elena sat on the back porch of their new home, watching her son chase fireflies in the garden. Shadow, now showing hints of grey around his muzzle, but still regal in his semi-retirement, maintained his vigilant position nearby, his amber eyes tracking the child's movements with devoted attention. "He's so much like Mike," Mrs. Winters observed, joining Elena with 2 steaming mugs of tea. The elderly woman had become a fixture in their lives, a surrogate grandmother whose weekly visits provided both practical support and gentle wisdom. Elena nodded, accepting the tea gratefully. "Sometimes when he laughs, it's like hearing Mike's voice again." Young Michael raced across the lawn, his dark curls bouncing with each step, his father's dimple appearing when he smiled triumphantly at capturing a firefly in his cupped hands. Shadow followed at a measured distance, maintaining the perfect balance between protection and freedom that had characterized his relationship with the child since birth. "He still sees him, you know," Mrs. Winters said quietly, nodding toward Shadow. "Not as often as before, but sometimes, especially on days like today." Elena had noticed it too, the subtle shifts in Shadow's attention, the familiar tilt of his head when he seemed to perceive something beyond ordinary awareness. These moments had decreased over time, becoming rare rather than regular occurrences, but they had never entirely disappeared. "Captain Morris called this morning," Elena said, changing the subject slightly. "They're making Shadow's retirement official next month. Full honors ceremony at department headquarters." Mrs. Winters smiled appreciatively. "Well deserved. 7 more successful deployments after Mike's passing. Remarkable for a K9 working with a secondary handler." Shadow's partnership with Officer Ramirez had indeed proved unexpectedly productive. The dog's exceptional training and intelligence compensating for the absence of the lifelong bond he had shared with Mike. Their final case together, tracking a kidnapped child through dense forest during a thunderstorm, had made national headlines. The miraculous rescue attributed to Shadow's unwavering determination despite challenging conditions. As the evening deepened, Michael ran toward them, breathless with excitement. "Mama, Shadow found something!" He tugged Elena's hand, pulling her toward a corner of the garden where Shadow sat in his formal alert position, focused on something half buried in the freshly turned soil. Elena knelt carefully, brushing away dirt to reveal a tarnished Chicago Police Department badge, Mike's badge, which had been missing since they'd moved into their new home months earlier. She lifted it reverently, cleaning the metal with her sleeve until the numbers became visible. 4722. How did this get here? She wondered aloud, looking to Mrs. Winters, who had followed more slowly with her cane. The elderly woman simply smiled, her eyes traveling to the space just beyond where Shadow sat at attention. "Some messages don't need words," she said softly. That night, after tucking Michael into bed with stories of his brave father, Elena placed the recovered badge in a shadow box alongside Mike's medals and photograph. Shadow settled on his bed beneath the display, his vigilant gaze sweeping the room one final time before resting on the empty space beside Michael's bed. In the peaceful silence, the nightlight flickered briefly, once, twice, 3 times, before stabilizing into a steady glow that would watch over them until morning.